The state election is underway in Queensland and Green preferences are crucial for Labor as it attempts to cling to power. Premier Anna Bligh has recently announced 8 more rivers will come under the Wild Rivers program in Cape York and other parts of the state. But there are claims tonight that the implementation of the Wild Rivers policy has been flawed from its inception. For its part, the Bligh government says the program will preserve the river's pristine environment. Critics say the policy is complicated and confusing, with no legal clarity on exactly what landholders on Cape York whose properties contain the wild rivers can and can't do. Late Line's Suzanne Smith prepared this special report.
On the campaign trail, the Premier travelled to Pomperau on the west coast and announced 8 more rivers would be added to the already 15 declared as wild rivers.
The contrast is stark. Under Labor, these rivers and this country will be protected. Under the LNP, wild rivers will be scrapped.
Yes, I throw a dead fish in your general direction.
The Premier tried to catch a fish. Unsuccessful though she was, it didn't matter. The locals had better luck. A great backdrop for her announcement that a Labor government would employ 50 more rangers to keep the rivers wild and pristine.
The Wild River Ranger program now employs 50 people in the Cape and the Gulf. They're not only looking after these pristine river systems, they are local Indigenous people who know this country, and they're doing a great job getting rid of feral pigs, clearing weeds and making sure this beautiful country is looked after.
But the reality on Queensland's biggest pastoral holding, a property that covers 900,000 hectares in Cape York and the Gulf, reveals a very different story. Scott Harris has the lease on this massive property. And this is the declared wild river, the Staten River. For him, the idea that 100 rangers can properly look after such large river systems is not realistic or workable. For the wild rivers to work as a policy, it relies on the local landholders like Scott Harris to do the clearing of weeds in the rivers and to make sure native vegetation is not choked with introduced vines. But Scott Harris says a lack of consultation and 6 pieces of complex legislation governing all aspects of land management have confused pastoralists about their rights and responsibilities.
Just with the legislation, you are unable to do anything to control weeds, ferals, anything like that. And like to get good access to it, it's impossible.
He says each declared wild river has a high preservation area 1 kilometre on each side of the river. In this area, he says, vegetation clearing is prohibited.
This is rubber vine. This is brought to Australia by someone who thought it would be a lovely garden ornament. But the best part about it, it will kill this tree. So for the environmentalists out there, you're going to save the environment, this is what you're doing. This is going to destroy the environment in Northern Australia for future generations. And the more you lock it up, the faster it's going to kill it. There's absolutely nothing we can do with this because he's growing up a native tree and they said we're not allowed to touch native trees. Someone needs to have some backbone and stand up to the environmental movement and say we are going to give the people on the land the power to look after their own backyard. Like, wake up to yourselves. Like, I want to be able to hand this property on to my kids. I want them to prosper here. I want them to have kids and carry it on. Like, the last thing any producer wants to see is their land be degraded.
The Wilderness Society, who brokered the Wild Rivers deal, says Scott Harris can do the maintenance work.
There's a whole range of activities, a very large range of activities that are self-assessable. The big things that are stopped by Wild River legislation are building large-scale water impoundments, levees and dams. That is the number one.
There's been a lot of misinformation about our Wild Rivers policy, particularly on the Cape. And there is no restriction whatsoever on clearing of feral pests or weeds. And I'm worried that that is just one of the many misinformation campaigns about wild rivers that's underway.
I reckon there's undoubtedly an argument for always reviewing the implementation of legislation to establish whether or not it's achieving its objectives.
Elder Wilfred Gordon runs one of the most successful Indigenous tourism businesses in Queensland. It now attracts visitors from around the world.
My job is to translate the rock art into a story. The art that we have on the rock are stories about animals or plants or spiritual things. But that's the rainbow serpent. Rainbow serpent is just the sun and water, and when water goes on a travel like a snake.
He is concerned that too much legislation and bureaucratic control is hurting Indigenous people's chances to become self-sufficient.
If you're going to lock up a place where people have their livelihood, and if you don't consult them properly, then it will impact onto the livelihood. Now, if we don't have any opportunities up here, do they want Cape Yorkers to go down to the city and find jobs in the city? The question is, are we going to keep our young people here?
He says young people want other opportunities, not just to be rangers.
We've got modern technology on our fingertips, and we do have all of these things. And if we don't move forward, then our children will miss out on the opportunities for getting themselves a good job. And if we don't have that, we'll be still in poverty all the time. The only question I got for Wilderness Society, how many of them are living in North Queensland? How many of them? Are they living in towns and places where they can have good health services and stuff like that? How many of those people live in North Queensland?
While there is support for the Wild Rivers policy in Cape York, many of the detractors live in the most important zones where the declared rivers are situated. They have been meeting in the past few months and they want a regional solution.
The major issues are declaring things like wild rivers World Heritage without actually talking to the people on the ground that have got the local knowledge of what works and what doesn't work.
Scott Harris and his family have for the last 5 years employed a solicitor to clarify their rights.
Another 100 miles, it runs out into the Gulf.
But it does.
Just wasted, absolutely wasted.
A government review of the Wild Rivers legislation is waiting to be released, but the Queensland government wants to wait until after the election. Suzanne Smith, Late Line.